I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies here in Berkeley. I'd like to welcome everyone in Chile and here in Berkeley as well. I'm Harley Shaken, the chair of the center, and we're very proud to be hosting this series on an intercontinental conversation on inequality in the Americas. In the United States today, on the eve of an important, even a pivotal election, the issue of inequality has been a recurrent and a critical theme. The notion of discussing it in the United States is important, but to discuss it on an intercontinental basis with our colleagues in Chile, I think provides a much richer and important and ultimately insightful discussion on these key issues. This is the third series that we've had, or the third program that we've had on inequality, an intercontinental conversation. The first was with Professor Robert Reich and former President of Chile, Ricardo Lagos. The second was with Professors Brad DeLong here in Berkeley and Oscar Landereche at the University of Chile. And this, of course, is our third one. We're very pleased to have with us Paul Pierson, who is the John Gross Professor of Political Science here at Berkeley. His most recent book is Winner Take All Politics: How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Back on the Middle Class. He is the former chair of the Department of Political Science here at Berkeley and one of the most insightful scholars and analysts about issues surrounding inequality in the United States today. In Chile, we're very pleased to have with us Daniel Hojman, who is the director of the Economics Ph.D. and Master's program at the University of Chile, and he's an associate professor at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He is a frequent commentator in the media on these issues, as well as many others, and also a very well-known and insightful scholar. We're going to have a very straightforward format. We will start with Professor Pierson here at Berkeley. He will speak for 15 minutes. Then we will have Professor Hojman at the University of Chile speaking for 15 minutes. Then Professor Pierson will ask Professor Hojman a question. Then Professor Hojman will ask a question here. Then we will open it up to our audience in Chile and here at Berkeley. So please join me in welcoming Paul Pierson.
Thank you, Harley, for that nice introduction and for setting this up. It's really fun to be part of such an innovative program. I'm sorry to miss out on the chance to have a trip to Santiago, but this has its advantages. I guess it's better for the environment to do it this way, and I can already see the advantage of having someone there holding up a copy of my book with Jacob Hacker, since I didn't bring one. I was able to listen to the first seminar that you held on this topic. I haven't yet had a chance to listen to the second one, so I hope I won't go over too much ground that you've already talked about. I suppose my distinctive potential contribution here is mainly to focus on the politics of what's been going on with the rise in inequality in the United States. But as Jacob and I argued in our book, we think understanding the politics requires first that one very important aspect of the rise in inequality in the United States be well understood. It's easy when we think about rising inequality to think about, the metaphor that I often use is think about a ladder and the rungs on a ladder, and imagine that as inequality is growing, that the rungs are just getting further apart from each other. The ladder is being stretched out. And that is one way in which you could see rising inequality, but it really doesn't capture what's happened in the United States over the last 30 or 40 years. It's interesting, we're now actually having a very lively conversation about inequality in the United States. Dramatically captured perhaps with the emergence and then I think pretty much disappearance of Occupy Wall Street, but a push to bring inequality to the attention of ordinary citizens around the slogan, "We are the 99%." But I think the data suggests that actually that slogan was slightly off, because it's not as if the big shift in the United States is a shift from the bottom 99% to the top 1%. In many ways, the shift in inequality towards what Jacob and I have called winner-take-all inequality, the gains are concentrated even more in the rungs of the income distribution above the top 1%. Right? So the data from Emmanuel Sayas, who teaches here at Berkeley, and Thomas Piketty, suggests that the income share of the top 1% in the US has basically doubled over the last 35 years or so, which is a stunning shift in income distribution. But if you tighten the microscope a little bit more to get a finer gradation of what's happened to the income distribution, let's focus on the top 100th of 1%. Right? These are the 15,000 richest households in the United States. In order to qualify for membership in this club, the bottom part of that income distribution are households making above about $8 million a year. Right? So now we're moving more into the realm of the Mitt Romneys of the world that we're talking about when we focus on the top 100th of 1%. Their income share over the last generation hasn't doubled. It's increased 600%. It's a really stunning shift, not just towards the upper quintile or decile that people sometimes talk about, but the very, very top of the income distribution. And I think it's quite relevant to recognize just how concentrated the gains have been in order to really make sense of what's been happening in the United States and to think about how it compares with other countries. Now, there has been more focus lately on this issue of income inequality, and one discussion, which I'm just going to touch on very quickly before turning to the politics, is a question of what the effect of rising inequality might be on the overall performance of an economy, on its levels of economic growth. Some people argue strongly that inequality is bad for economic growth. Actually, I think what evidence we have on this is pretty mixed. Though there are some who argue that you can tease out negative effects for economic growth from rising income inequality or in societies where inequality is higher. The evidence actually turns out to be pretty complicated on this point. But what I would want to highlight before turning to the politics is you really can't assess what the consequences of this recent American experience have been by studying changes in the income distribution over a very wide range of countries over very long periods of time, because what's happened in the United States is virtually unique. I'd say we actually have maybe 1.5 cases in human history of what's been going on in the United States. And when I say that it's unique, what I mean is we have lots of experiences of highly unequal societies, but we do not have experience with wealthy countries that had a relatively broad distribution of income, had been prosperous and democratic for extended periods of time, had developed welfare states, and then became dramatically more unequal with the shift of income to the very top of the income distribution. Like I said, maybe there's 1.5 cases. The reason why I say there are 1.5 cases is because the country that looks the closest to the American experience is Great Britain. Great Britain has seen something like the shift in its income distribution over the last 30 years. And interestingly, it's the other country with the most developed financial sector, and I think that's probably not a coincidence. All right? But pretty much this is terra incognita for thinking about what happens when you get very high levels of inequality and this particular kind of inequality where most of the gains are going to the top of the income distribution, what does that do to a society? We don't know. Right? We don't have historical experience with this kind of phenomenon. I want to focus on one aspect of it, which is the political dimension, which I actually think is the one that I'm most qualified to talk about, but I actually think it's critical. I think the question to be asked, and here a discussion with our friends in Latin America I think is extremely helpful for putting this in a broader context. The question is the United States turning into an oligarchy? Is the United States turning into the kind of country in which economic power is so concentrated at the top, right, that spills over into political power, therefore transforming the entire society in a way that just reinforces and locks in those economic advantages? And I think that's a very live question, and I want to say a few things about it. First, in starting to think about how changes in the distribution of income that I've described could affect politics, I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what's happened to the financing of election campaigns in the United States. And I have to say that in the past, this has been a subject that Jacob and I have not focused that much of our attention on, because we've argued that the really important changes in American politics have to do with political organization rather than just campaign contributions. Business has become much more organized. Organized labor has become much weaker. Politics and fights over public policy are what we call organized combat. And so it's the shift in organizational resources that's really critical. Campaign finance is significant. It's more of a symptom than anything else, though. But I have to say, looking at what's happened to campaign finance in the last few years in the United States, especially following the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision and other court cases which have made it even easier than it already was for wealthy individuals and corporations to put money into campaigns, has begun to change my view about the role of finance. Just a couple of quick indicators of what's happening to the financing of elections in the United States. In 1996, people talked about how Bill Clinton, when he was running for re-election, was the greatest fundraiser that American politics had ever seen. Right? The cost in terms of campaign contributions for the 1996 presidential election, and this is all in current dollars, so inflation does not figure into this comparison. Combined, the campaigns for Clinton and Dole, all the money that was put into that presidential election was about $300 million. Okay. This year, it's going to be about $2 billion. Right. So, not inflation, using the same value of dollars, almost a seven-fold increase in the amount of spending just on the presidential campaigns. And of course, the same thing is happening, maybe not quite as dramatically, in other elections as well. One aspect of that funding, important aspect of it, is that more and more of it is happening outside of the traditional campaign system. The part that gets the most attention has been the creation of what we call super PACs, right, that people can make unlimited contributions to. But there's a huge amount of money, often money where we don't even know who is making the contributions, which is falling through nonprofits, or so-called nonprofits, that are really engaged in electioneering, that are spending even more than the super PACs are. But we have the best data available, actually, on the super PACs, and there, just one striking statistic is that of the money that was raised up to about July of this year, over $150 million flowing into super PACs. The majority of that money, almost 60% of that money, came from just 47 individuals. 47 people, all of whom gave at least $1 million, some of whom gave much, much more than $1 million, accounted for almost 60% of all the money that was flowing into super PACs. Right? So the ability of the wealthy to put their money into campaigns has dramatically increased in American politics. And I think there are lots of reasons to worry about what the consequences of that were. And I want to emphasize, I think there were lots of possibilities for that shift towards a winner-take-all economy to spill over into politics, through lobbying, through organization, well before the Citizens United decision in 2010. But clearly, it's just continued to ramp up. And I think that there is a lot of reason to be concerned about that. There would be an enormous amount to be said about how this is affecting governance. I don't have time to get into it, but let me just make a couple of very quick points about how the policy agenda in Washington seems to be quite different from the one that you would probably get from the average voter in the United States, but seems to dovetail much more with the interests and concerns of those at the top of the income distribution. And political scientists are just now starting to get some quite interesting survey data on truly wealthy Americans, something that we'd never had before. The results will not surprise you. They reveal that the views on economic issues of the truly wealthy are significantly more conservative than those of average Americans. They are much more preoccupied with the deficit. They're much more willing to cut programs like Social Security that provide a modest income for Americans over the age of 65. If you look, just to show two ways in which this shows up in Washington. The wealthy are much, much more concerned about the deficit than average Americans are. And guess what is economic issue number one in Washington? The deficit, not unemployment, right? Which if you interview ordinary voters, they'll talk to you about unemployment and they're concerned about job creation. They won't talk to you about the deficit. In fact, in last week's presidential debate where ordinary voters were given the chance to ask questions, they asked many questions about the economy. They asked 0 questions about the deficit. Right? The wealthy care about the deficit. If you ask ordinary Americans, if you do ask them about the deficit and say, well, what would you like to do to reduce the deficit? Because they will say that they want to reduce the deficit. Truth is, most of their answers don't add up. They want to do things that actually wouldn't have much of an effect on the deficit. But there are 2 things that actually would make a difference for the deficit that get majority support in public opinion polls. One is to cut defense spending, and the other is to increase taxes on the richest Americans. Neither of those possible responses get anything like the same sort of support in Washington that they do from public opinion polls. So that's just a little bit of circumstantial evidence that I think suggests that the American political system has been significantly affected by the dramatic shift in economic resources to not the 1%, but the 0.1% or the 0.01%. 2 economists, James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu, have recently written a book about this, about the circumstances under which you get prosperous societies over the long term. And they argue that our ability to do this depends on whether or not you can orient both the political system and the economic system in what they call an inclusive direction, right? Generating broad positive sum gains rather than in an extractive direction, right? In which the powerful, small powerful minorities are more focused both in the political system and in the economic system towards figuring out what they can scrape out of the society rather than creating the conditions that generate long-term prosperity across many income groups. And I think it is a fair question to ask in the United States whether we are turning into a more extractive political and economic system. And it's an interesting question to juxtapose with speakers from Latin America, because we used to look to the South and say, that's where the extractive economies are. We would look to countries like Mexico and Brazil and say, those are the examples of economic oligarchies. And I think there's an interesting question to be asked, especially given some of the relatively favorable trends having to do with inequality in Latin America in the last decade or so, or whether the United States is somehow trading places with some of its southern neighbors. Let me just close with a quote, more eloquent, I think, than the terminology I've been using so far, from the great progressive jurist from the early part of the 20th century in the United States, Louis Brandeis, who I think summed up the issue that we face today. He said, "We must make our choice. We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of the few, but we can't have both."
And now with that introduction, we move to Chile and Daniel Hojman.
So aside from this little accident, I want to say, first of all, how excited we are here at Universidad de Chile to be part of this exchanges across continents. I think it's an incredible experience. I'm very happy to be part of this collaboration, and I hope we are able to do something similar in many more opportunities looking towards the future. So on behalf of the Facultad de Economía y Negocios of Universidad de Chile and the Center for New Development, you're very welcome to this exchange as well. So the first thing I want to say is that I'm an economist, but given that these dialogues are supposed to be about the politics of inequality, I'd like to talk mostly about politics. So my apologies in advance for taking that risk. Specifically, I'd like to provide some thoughts on the erosion of common interest and the legitimacy of democratic institutions, which I think are fairly in tune with what Paul was talking to us about towards the end of his presentation. And I'll focus on Chile, but I think that the erosion of common interest is probably at the heart of the malaise of indignation in Europe, Spain, and even Israel. I actually think that the erosion of common interest is one of the main consequences of persistent and severe inequality. I also think that it's probably at the heart of any political challenge that societies may have in achieving a path of human development that enhances human equal opportunities and the dignity of each member of a given community. And so I'll start with some facts about Chile, which, as opposed to the United States, I'll call is an adolescent country. And because I'm not really sure exactly what the background people have with respect to Chilean history, and so I want to make some very basic statements about some facts, and then I'll probably move more into what I think are the main challenges for the Chilean political system. So, of course, historically, Latin America has been a region with the highest income inequality in the world. And there's many reasons, and Paul was pointing at some of them. There's an extractive process of colonization, and then, of course, the blessing or curse of natural resource abundance. Today, this inequality remains high, and I would say that Chile, normally seen as a country fairly successful in achieving sustained growth for the last 20 plus years, is actually an average country in terms of inequality with respect to Latin America, which is, as I mentioned, a region of very high inequality. But an important point, I think, is to keep in mind that there have been dynamics. In other words, Argentina did experience a significant amount of compression during the 20th century. And if we look at Emmanuel Saez and Piketty's evidence for the rest of the world, the US included in Europe, I think that's a common trend, this idea that you can achieve a significant amount of compression. Similarly, Brazil, over the last 2 decades, has also improved significantly. And I would say that even though we perceive Chilean inequality as being fairly persistent over the last 2 decades, there has been significant action before that. So, for example, in the late 60s and in the early 70s, before the dictatorship, Chile actually had a Gini coefficient that was around 0.4. Towards the end of the dictatorship, the Gini coefficient went up to 0.58, so a marked increase. And then towards the early part of the recovery of democracy, the Gini coefficient fell a little bit. And so that was the early 90s. And since, it has remained around 0.53, 54, and it's been fairly stagnant. And so the difference with the US is that even though there is an underlying trend in primary inequality, by which I mean primary income disregarding transfers from government, that is actually in the same direction of the US with some increase in inequality. The truth is that if once you consider transfers, the inequality in the US is more like one of stagnation and high inequality. The second fact about the current Chilean society is that there has been an enormous amount of what I call marketization. That is to say that markets have become the prevalent form of social exchange in the Chilean society since the reforms in the dictatorship. And this includes also the provision of public goods such as schooling. The third point I want to make is that there has been an oligopolization of the private. So there's a significant concentration of wealth and power, and this probably increased sharply during the dictatorship. In particular, privatizations favored groups that were close to the regime and also the historical economic oligarchies and elites. Today, an expression of this is that most markets are actually small oligopolies with a high degree of concentration and with significant economic rents, by which I mean that the rents are of the order of 15 to 20% return on equity, which is relatively high for an advanced, for the OECD, for example. There's also a significant concentration in other markets. That is to say, a significant concentration in markets that I would call ideology markets or cultural transmission markets. This expresses itself in a very concentrated and low ideologically diverse traditional media market. It's also true about politics. So money is highly concentrated in right-wing parties. And it's also probably true about education. The fourth point, which is actually a trend in a bit of the opposite direction, is the surge of a new middle class. So large segments of the population now satisfy basic needs. This was not true at the beginning of the recovery of democracy. And there's been a bit of a model which I would call integration through consumption. And this expresses today in the fact that there are large differences across cohorts, for example, in the level of high school education. People in their 60s now would have graduation rates around 60%. People in their 30s probably closer to 30%. On the other hand, a central characteristic of this new middle classes is that they have very high expectations, they're very vulnerable, and they have a relatively low quality of life in comparison with OECD countries and upper classes in the country. In particular, they have very high levels of debt. And even though younger generations are considerably more educated than the previous generation and have access to networks and communication, it is unclear whether they will be getting better jobs than their parents. I want to talk a little bit about segregation. Even though this is not inequality, even though it's not separation in the consumption or income space, I think there's been a trend in segregation in Chile, which is very important, and it's something that manifests itself in every domain. So in other words, in particular, the elites are very segregated and very far apart from the rest of the population. There's a sixth fact that I'd like to emphasize, which is something that I'm calling the insulation of politics. There has been an oligopolization, actually a duopolization and freezing of the political system. We can get into the details in a while, but overall, all of these facts have implied a concentration of power and the insulation of elites. And I think all of these contribute to the erosion of common interest or common good. even this integration through consumption, I think, does not really contribute to this sense of common interest, because it actually, you cannot really attach meaning, collective meaning, to consumption. One puzzling fact about Chile, I would say, is that, first thing, inequality in Chile in the last decades has been stagnant, but it has not increased. Farther, I would say that recent studies show that entitlements in health and some advances in education, if anything, have reduced slightly inequality. On the other hand, the recession here over the last couple of years has been fairly mild. Moreover, the last 2 years have been years of strong recovery and high growth performance, 6%, 5%. In contrast, in countries like the US and Spain, where there has been indignation as well, there's unemployment, and there's this feeling of the socialization of private costs that some believe originate in an incompetent or greedy financial elite. But this is not true necessarily about Chile. Despite this, we've had the largest protests and social movements in Chile since the late 80s. And so that's a bit of a puzzle. Why is it that a country that has been growing, and at the same time a country that, true, has stagnated a little bit with respect to the diminishing inequality, but if anything has improved in that dimension, is experiencing nowadays the largest protest since the end of the dictatorship? What explains indignation in Chile? And so I want to finish with this, which I think is a bit illustrative of the political puzzle that the country is facing right now. The first thing that I think explains indignation in Chile is that there's this heightened demands of fairness in conflict with perceptions of abuse. There's this increased perception that the country is far from fair in a number of domains. So even though absolute standards of living of the population have been improving, it has become unacceptable now to get a relatively low level of education or health just because I was born in a household that does not have enough income to basically afford better education. And so it's now become a bit more prevalent, this view that it's morally unacceptable to access health, poor health or education for something that I'm really not responsible for. The second thing is that there's a very large sense in which social inequality reflects itself in every domain of life. People, this is a recent study from the UNDP, seem to feel that they are not respected, that there's very low dignity in their life, and this is something that manifests when they take transportation. Many people, for example, in a city like Santiago, might actually take a couple of hours to get from their house to work, in a trial, when they buy, etc. There's also a sense that the market, these oligopolies, abuse their market power. And so many of the business models that you see operating are models where, for something like a retail oligopoly or a pharmacy, will basically enable people to consume based on debts that they also provide to people. And the interest rates that they charge are very abusive, of the order of 30 or 40% per year. Aside from this abuse of market power associated to the oligopolization of economic markets, I think there's also a sense in which people have started feeling that there's an abuse of political power. And actually this has two different dimensions. There's a sense in which the right that has been historically associated with the defense of the oligarchies, and now maybe less so, but it's very entrenched with business groups, basically set up the constitution during the dictatorship. And many changes now are basically very hard to attain because they are associated with very high quorums. Furthermore, the electoral system is one, which it's called a binominal system. I think we're the only country in the world that has it, which basically ensures that in any district, there's going to be one member elected for each of the main coalitions. 2 members elected in each district that provides incentives for 2 large coalitions. That has been stable. Some people think that's actually a good thing. But on the other hand, it's a frozen system. It's very hard for a minority to get in. With 35% of the vote are ensured a representative. So it's very hard to challenge. And it's also very bad from the perspective of moral hazard. There's another fact which goes beyond this securing of the new regime sort of installed by the dictatorship, which is actually associated to an abuse of power on the center left, on concertación, which basically governed the country for 20 years until two years ago. And there's a sense in which concertación feels that they basically are representing well their constituents, but I think that most polls would say the opposite. Concertación, there's a sense in which they have detached from social movements, which were very, very, very much part of what they ended up channeling in the recovery of democracy. There's another point which is associated to an increased sense of private or corporate interest in conflict with the common good. And you can see this both in the financing of politics, in lobby, but also in the fact that many politicians end up being captured by firms. Because of this, I think that there's a fracture between society or the people, civil society, and the economic, political, and technocratic elites. So there's a sense in which most of society, and this is something that all polls have been revealing, distrust the elites. So this is very much in line with what Paul was talking about when he made reference to the Acemoglu-Robinson book. I think we're experiencing precisely a situation where the elites are not being particularly inclusive. But beyond that, this distrust could go even beyond the fact that people may perceive that the elites have vested interests in their policymaking or in their influence of policymaking. People maybe have also started distrusting the qualification of the elites to manage politics, the environment, or financial firms. I think this is something probably common to many other countries in the world. And so it's unclear what is the value of this political or economic or technocratic intermediation for large segments of the population. And so that's actually, I think, a very big question in Chile and also in the rest of the world. It's actually a big question for representative democracies is what is the value of intermediation in situations where most of the people, most of the country may feel that the elites are not really solving some of the main issues, such as, for example, inequality and other social demands. And so I think, and this is, I think, my wrap-up, that the Chilean democracy is showing signs that it's been unable to negotiate a shared purpose. It's basically been unable to provide a sense of common interest, and that this is highly associated to the inability of the political system to respond to inequality, social fragmentation, market and political abuse, and distrust. So I'll stop there and probably send it back to you guys in California.
Great. I'd like to make a brief comment on the two opening presentations before we go to Paul Pierson, who will ask a question of Danielle. And the brief remarks are, we've clearly seen in the opening comments an intersection of economics, politics, and the very character of society. Economics, Paul Pierson began by looking at how this inequality is profoundly different than what we've seen before. The example of the 15,000 families in the US and the income gains that were astronomical really summarizes that. Politics, the danger of oligarchy undermining democratic society, is disturbing and very real. And finally, what Danielle Hojman began with, the notion of common interest in a society being undermined by the growth of inequality. This as a basis for a discussion today and going forward, I think puts a lot of issues with critical import on the table. So Paul?
Well, that was a really wonderful presentation, Daniel, and I actually would like to ask you a lot of questions. I think this theme of the loss of a sense of common interest or a shared fate that is coming in some ways from both directions, right? That the elite is becoming more walled off in various ways from the rest of the population, and that the population in important ways recognizes that their level of confidence in the elites has really declined. I think that resonates with a lot of the experience here, and as you were saying, I think in a lot of other countries as well. The question I want to ask is maybe to get at one aspect where economics and politics connects, and maybe to ask you something that plays to your expertise in economics as well. You mentioned that in Chile there is this sense of unfairness, and that I think you're right to say that there are many historical examples where unfairness is really a spur to political action, that it's not just enough for people to think that their lives are bad. They have to actually think that there's something wrong with that, right? That somehow is a set of circumstances that can and should be corrected. And of course, when you're talking about inequality, one of the big controversies is whether it can be corrected or whether it can be corrected at an affordable price, right? And I guess I'm wondering what you would say both about that as an economic question and as a political question for Chile, right? So, because we could talk about whether or not a conservative view is right in saying that inequality is just a product of changes in the world economy, and that we could try to do something about it, but if we did, we would damage the economy. So you just have to more or less accept it, which is certainly rhetoric that we hear in the United States as well. I get some sense from your remarks that maybe you think that there are certainly important elements of inequality that could be reduced in Chile without it having adverse economic effects. But I wondered if you could say something about that. And then also, not just as an economist, but as an observer of Chilean society, is that conversation a live conversation in Chile? Are people talking about whether or not reductions in inequality is something that's possible in the world economy that we live in today?
Thanks, Paul. It's a wonderful question, and it's a very big one too. So I'll give you my view, which is probably wrong, but I'll give it a try. So, so the first thing is, if you look at the history of the evolution of inequality in other countries, so if you take this big picture view about how inequality evolved in, say, Europe, vis-a-vis the United States, and so on, I think you basically get a sense, and this also comes actually from the work of Emmanuel Saez, Piketty, and Atkinson. There's that during the 20th century, most of the advanced democracies did achieve a significant compression in their income distribution, and that this was probably, very explicit in FDR's policies in the US, and it was also very explicit in some European countries, especially after the war. And the other thing is that they started from similar levels of inequality and very high levels of inequality. And having said that, these were also times where these countries experienced a significant amount of growth, of economic growth. And so basically, I think this view that it's hard to achieve sustainable growth and at the same time consistently reduce inequality is just wrong, looking at the data. The second thing is that when you look towards the end of the 20th century, it is true that some countries more liberal, well, I would say liberal from a Chilean perspective, but maybe conservative would be the right word in the US, countries such as, or more free market oriented countries, societies that have smaller governments and smaller welfare states, such as the US and Great Britain, towards the end of the century, they have experienced this polarization, this increase in inequality. However, other countries, such as, say, France or Nordic countries, have not. And on the other hand, if you look at the primary income distribution, that is to say at the income distribution before taxes and transfers, Sweden looks a lot like the US. And so there's a lot of work being done by institutions in preventing inequality to surge in other countries, as opposed to vis-a-vis the US. And if you look at competitiveness reports, well, it turns out that among the most competitive countries in the world, and then this is basically getting at the point of, well, how good is it to make business in these countries? How can this country sustain growth and in productivity and so on? It turns out that among those countries, you'll see that the Nordic countries are doing very, very well. So what I mean is that this idea that you can, I think, both reduce inequality and aspire to sustained prosperity is something that you can see even now in this differential paths across advanced democracies. With respect to Chile, as I mentioned, we're an adolescent country, and I agree with you that the US is a bit different in that you're a wealthier country that experienced a significant amount of compression, and now it's going in the other direction. For us, it's a bit different, but it's a huge question. I mean, I think that there's a sense in which progressives or the center, many of people who are thinking about Chile in the center left, it's hard to be neutral on this because there's contrasting views in the country, think that this can be handled. In other words, it seems like feasible to reduce inequality in a way that is responsible as opposed to populist, and that is not violent. In other words, that is done within the institutions that we have, within a democratic framework. But on the other hand, this requires significant structural transformations that involve the tax code, labor regulation, education for sure, and the issue is the big challenge whether the political system will be able to respond to this demands on the one hand, and will be able to channel these structural reforms. And there's some question with respect to that. And the reason is that the system is so gridlocked that it seems to have lost the ability to self-correct and learn. And so the pessimistic view would be the political system now has become an impediment to social and political learning, and it's probably, there's a chance that it may not be able to channel these structural transformations. On the other hand, the optimistic view is that improvements in the democratic systems are feasible, and so are changes in the structure of the economy, again, that involve changes in the tax code, in labor regulation, education, and so on, and political industrial policy, which is a very big issue in Chile given the lack of diversification of our GDP, which is very much intensive in natural resources, will actually end up working. But I think there's a very, so this is precisely the question that that the Chilean society is facing. And just let me round this up saying that I would say that yes, this is being hotly debated in Chile. We have elections a week from now. These are local elections, and we have elections a year from now. And I would say that these are the big issues that we're facing. And there's other issues which we can probably discuss in another time. But I think these are precisely the issues that are being discussed and grappled with in our society.
We're running a little tight on time, so Danielle, a question for Paul, and Paul, we'd ask you to keep the answer relatively brief.
I actually have a very similar question than basically Paul had for me, and I'll be very quick. So, given the polarization of fates that the 1% and the 99% have been experiencing in the US and the signs of plutocracy, what are the main cultural, political, and institutional challenges that the United States faces in reducing inequality over the next decades or so?
So I'm supposed to be concise in answering that. I mean, it's obviously, it's very, very multifaceted. And let me just pick up on one element that again, I'm struck by the parallels in the way that you describe the political system in Chile, because people in the United States also discuss gridlock, the inability of government to seem to be able to respond effectively to any of the challenges that it faces. It's rooted in a different set of political institutions here. The way that I would describe it is that first of all, the capacity to obstruct has increased greatly in the United States. The use of what's called the filibuster to block legislation requiring a supermajority has become a much more prevalent part of American politics. And that's been accompanied by the increasingly parliamentary style of our parties. So they used to be very loose coalitions, and it used to be possible to develop public policy that was bipartisan, or at least somewhat bipartisan. Now that's almost impossible, and I think that's especially true because of changes on the Republican side, which are connected with the rising role, I think, of wealth and corporate power in American democracy. So you have a situation where government is rendered ineffective because it can't act. And it creates a kind of vicious cycle where voters become more and more frustrated with the functioning of their institutions, more and more disillusioned and disaffected. And none of this is neutral. People often talk about it in American politics as if it's somehow neutral between the parties and between different groups within American society, but it all pushes to reinforce, if government is essentially immobilized, it all pushes to reinforce the kinds of trends that you were talking about, where elites become more and more separate, where the society is becoming more and more driven by markets, and sometimes pretty shady markets that are highly oligopolistic and seem to be more consistent with a kind of extraction among people who are in a position to translate political power into economic power and then back into political power. And all of this involving government being rendered pretty ineffective in responding to it. So I don't know how these changes would come about. I think there obviously needs to be much more political organization on the side of people who are losing out from these trends. But I think an aggressive push to address government dysfunction and the way that it contributes to some of the broader pathologies that I think are emerging in American society. For me, the filibuster would be the first target. You just can't effectively run a political system and can't have it provide an effective check on the market economy, which I think all successful societies have involved governments that can be at times an effective check on the market economy, because markets don't in and of themselves produce beautiful outcomes. If you lose that, you've really lost the capacity to create broadly based prosperity. And in the US, I think there needs to be a great deal of focus on figuring out how we can get a government that's functional again, which we will never have if we have parliamentary style parties, especially one that I think has become more extreme, operating in a climate where the minority can veto what the majority wants to do.
Unfortunately, with that, we're just about out of time for this discussion. Clearly, we are beginning a discussion, not ending it. And I'd like to emphasize or correct perhaps a little bit of a misunderstanding. This isn't meant in lieu of Paul Pierson going to Chile or Danielle Hojman coming to Berkeley, but as the introduction to this exchange taking place amongst our colleagues and friends in both universities, in both countries, and across a wider and more international arena. I think there were some very valuable ideas and perspectives and challenges that were presented. A videotape of this will be up on the Center for Latin American Studies website this Wednesday afternoon. We look forward to comments on our Facebook page and over the internet, and we look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you in Chile. Paul Pierson, thank you here. Thank you all for coming in Berkeley.
Thank you.